Good morning, Dawg Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We got so much to do. Early morning commitment to the Georgia Bulldogs, and it's a big one. We'll tell you about that here coming up. Connor Riley going to join us today. There's a lot to talk to Connor about. It's been kind of unfolding around UGA over the course of the last 7 days or so. There was something I intended to do on yesterday's show that I did not get a chance to do. Just kind of really blew right past it, so we'll do that as a part of Around the DawgHouse today. It relates to Kirby Smart and some wise words from Kirby on a topic that's out there right now. We'll cover a lot of that. Frankly, we're going to be kind of spending the next few days looking at some of the stuff that Kirby Smart has recently said. So an example of that here today. There's good news for a couple of former Georgia Bulldogs, potentially. We'll talk about that. Dogs have hired a baseball coach, the Diamond Dogs have, so we'll kind of touch on that. The point is, there's a lot going on. We're going to try to cover it all with you over the course of the next few minutes, so we're glad to have you with us as we try. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
If you think about national championship contending teams, it's kind of a club, sort of like a nightclub or something like that, then the entry into that club, the cover charge, that's the phrase I'm looking for. The cover charge you have to pay to be in that club, I believe, is elite defensive line play. That, you can have a great quarterback and you can have a great wide receiver and you can have all these kinds of things, and that can make you fun to watch and it might even make you good. But if you want to be great, you better make sure you've got elite defensive line play. It's, to me, the thing that separates the SEC from the rest of college football. If you look at a program like Ohio State that sort of thinks of itself as somewhat SEC-like in the Big Ten, what makes them different than the rest of that league? It's also a history of playing, pretty good on the defensive line there as well. That whatever the group of teams that you would consider as legitimate, true national championship contenders, the cover charge they paid to get into that club was elite defensive line play. That has been true for Georgia now for quite some time. And if you want to make sure you maintain that as a strength moving into the future, you've got to win those kinds of recruiting battles. There's always going to be a small number of truly top-flight defensive linemen. It's probably true for offensive line there as well, but in the defensive line space, there's always going to be a limited number of high-quality, elite athletes that have the size to play in the defensive line in the SEC, and those recruiting battles in every year are always going to be some of the most important battles that you wage. And there was a time not all that long ago for Georgia, you want to go 5-6 years in the past, something like that this Georgia team, unfortunately, more often than not, had been kind of on the outside looking in for these big-time defensive line recruiting wins. But somewhere along the way that changed. A lot of that, I think, has to do with Trey Scott. We'll get more into Trey here in a moment. But somewhere along the way, under the leadership of Kirby Smart, that changed. Georgia started winning with the very best defensive linemen in state, and in many cases, the very best defensive linemen around the country. And lo and behold, they've got a stack of national championship trophies. Those two ideas are closely connected. Now, I say all of that as a precursor to saying, welcome to Dawg Nation to Justin Greene, the 4-star defensive lineman. This is a guy who, you look at 24/7 Sports Composite, things like that. This is a guy who's sort of knocking on the door of being kind of a top 10 defensive lineman nationally, knocking on the door of being a top 100 recruit overall. This is a big-time recruiting win. And early this morning, fresh off an official visit to Georgia this past weekend, Justin Greene was ready to go public, and he was ready to announce his pledge to the Georgia Bulldogs. In fact, we'll show you the nice, if you're watching a video, good-looking edit of Greene there. I love the story that Jeff Sintel wrote about Justin at DawgNation.com this morning, announcing that commitment. And Jeff tells a great story about Justin. Maybe one of the most important things to understand about him as a player, the fact that, over the course of the last, year plus, this guy's added a lot of good weight, become a bigger guy that was already kind of a Power 5 level, maybe even an SEC level, recruit, a couple of years ago, but has now gotten on the radar for the University of Georgia simply because now he's added the kind of elite size that goes along with the kind of plus athleticism that you want from a defensive lineman. And Georgia, Trey Scott, to his credit, staying in close contact this entire time, ready to scoop up and win that commitment battle now that Greene, I think, has really improved himself as a prospect. This is Mountain View High School. It's kind of in Lawrenceville, Georgia, so checks the box for Georgia when it comes to Gwinnett County. That's an area in which Georgia has not always won with overall. But you certainly win with Justin Greene here, and I think that is really good news. It also is kind of funny because we've actually already been on video this morning talking about the Justin Greene news. I think we took the air somewhere around 7:30 or so. Greene had announced his commitment probably 15, 20 minutes prior to that, like really right at almost 7 a.m., maybe just before 7 a.m. Greene announced his commitment there, and it got a lot of DawgNation kind of off guard. I think even Kirby Smart's Go Dogs tweet was a little late this morning because of how early Greene announced that commitment. I thought David Cooper, who's a part of the, a great part of the Georgia recruiting staff, had a funny tweet about all of this, about DawgNation kind of, wiping the sleep out of its eyes this morning and waking up to the good news here. Let me show you what David Cooper had to say about that. He says, them boys couldn't even walk the dog in peace this morning. They found out we've already added another elite young king in the building. He says the trench bomb has got them stressing, and obviously David Cooper is always really funny with the tweets that he puts out, celebrating all the good recruiting news that Georgia gets. But this morning, indeed, and you see the funny meme there with Matthew McConaughey there as well. A lot of Georgia fans had their coffee interrupted, the breakfast interrupted, as Coach Cooper says there, walking the dog was kind of interrupted this morning there as well, with the fact that Georgia won this major recruiting battle. And I think the place I want to go with all of this just for a moment is that if you want to talk about what makes Georgia Georgia right now, I do believe it's the success of Georgia's position coaches that are kind of demonstrating program strength as much as almost anything else is. And that's not to disrespect Kirby Smart. Obviously, Kirby Smart has proven himself, we believe, to be the top coach in college football right now. But I think back to when Kirby was first hired, and I think back to some of the early recruiting success that Georgia had. Think about the class of 2017 as a for instance on this. Early groundwork for the class of 2018 even as well. It seems like at the time what Georgia was doing was leveraging some of the relationships that Kirby Smart had built with players while he was an assistant coach at Alabama. And as you know, many of you follow recruiting kind of understand this, that you have freedom and ability to connect with recruits as an assistant coach in a way that you kind of don't as a head coach. Head coach's contact with recruits is more limited than the assistant coach, who can be kind of out there with them all the time. So when Kirby first became a head coach, he had all these recruits that he knew really well, and Georgia, I think, got some easy recruiting wins in the first couple of years under Smart because Kirby had long, well-developed relationships with a lot of recruits in a couple of different classes, and Georgia kind of benefited from that. But there was sort of the skeptic at the time, and I think this was a fair question to ask, but the kind of more skeptical-minded person at the time was also looking at this, and they were saying, okay, well, Kirby's getting these easy recruiting wins right now, but we're going to find out in a couple of years what kind of head coach Kirby's really going to be, because at that point in time, he's going to be recruiting guys that he doesn't know quite as well as he recruits these guys right now. And it's going to be about the kind of program he can build, the kind of assistants he puts in place, the kind of continuity he can maintain with those assistants. There are people back then who were saying, we're going to find out more about Kirby Smart as a recruiter and as a leader of a program in a few years once it's his assistants that he hires that's out there doing the work that Smart had been doing when he was working for Alabama. Well, guess what? Now we have seen the full fruit of that kind of come into full display here, and we are quite impressed with what's coming to the table. That Kirby Smart legitimately, I think, has been able to hire and hold on to best tight ends coach in the country in Todd Hartley, best linebackers coach in the country in Glenn Schumann, who's also now defensive coordinator. Guys like Fran Brown, Chidera Uzodiribe look like rising stars in the coaching ranks. They were identified by Kirby Smart. On and on you can go. Veteran guys like Stacey Searles and Brian McClendon being kind of back in the fold here. And a guy like Trey Scott, who when he was first hired by Georgia, let's face it, Trey Scott was not a famous guy. He had just recently been hired by Ole Miss after having been at UNC. And frankly, when you're working at North Carolina during that era, you're not winning the kind of recruiting battles that would have given any kind of indication of how good a coach a guy like Trey Scott could be at a place like Georgia. It takes an eye for identifying a rising star in the coaching ranks the same way that Kirby Smart has a good eye for identifying, player talent. You have to identify that coaching talent there as well, and Kirby Smart clearly did that. But when you look at the way in which that Georgia, once again, going to have an elite defensive line, we believe it'll still be the best in the country this year, even absent Jalen Carter and absent 3 first-round picks from the 2021 team. We think the 2023 Georgia defensive line is still going to be just fine, and it's a guy like Trey Scott who I think deserves the credit for that. And Trey Scott embodies, I believe, what's very, very good about Georgia right now, that the ultimate strength that Georgia has is I don't believe there's a program out there at all that has a deeper array of position coaches than what Georgia has. So when you see another win like this for Justin Greene coming into the Georgia program, I think it points to the work that Trey Scott's doing on a daily basis. And to accentuate the point that I'm making here, I want to go back. One of the things that Greene told another outlet was, hey, I looked at the way in which Georgia was having such great defensive line success. He was naming players that had kind of come through there. And basically he said, I just kind of want to follow in the footsteps of all of that the success that Georgia has had has impressed a guy like Greene. He wants to be the next generation of all of that. Well, one of those defensive linemen that kind of came of age at Georgia, eventually became a first-round pick, was Devontae Wyatt. And if we're going to credit Trey Scott for cultivating this defensive line now over the course of a number of years, what Wyatt said about Trey Scott just prior to NFL draft 2 years ago when he became a first-round pick, to me this resonates heavily. And this is why guys like Justin Greene want to be a part of this team, and maybe Justin Scott coming up here very soon, other great defensive linemen in future years. It's the relationship that a coach like Trey Scott forges with these players that makes all of this happen. So when you think about why Justin Greene chose Georgia, the words of a guy like Devontae Wyatt a couple of years ago, I think explains this very well. Now, the audio quality is not great on this because it was from Pro Day and there's noise all over the place, but I still want you to hear it. This is Devontae Wyatt speaking about the special relationship he had with Trey Scott, and this is why Georgia wins so many defensive line recruiting battles. This is Devontae Wyatt.
He did an amazing job. You asked me for the three guys and the guys in the room right now, the guys we had in the past, but he did definitely like a father figure. He's been a coach when he needed to be. He's been a dad when he needed to be. He's been a mentor when he needed to be. And he's the guy you can depend on. He's the guy you can call. Even if you're going through something, you can call him, call Coach Scott. He'll make you laugh and give you great advice.
So listen, we live in an NIL age where I think that the overall nature of recruiting is probably more transactional than it's ever been before. But don't let that fool you about relationships not mattering. Relationships still matter. And what Devontae Wyatt says right there is why Trey Scott wins so many of these big-time recruiting battles, like the one that was just won for Justin Greene. That he can be a father figure when he needs to be. He can be a coach when he needs to be. He can be a mentor when he needs to be. If you just want to laugh, Trey Scott can make you laugh. If you need some good advice, Trey Scott can give you some good advice. Those are the words of Devontae Wyatt. Kirby Smart will tell you, hey, that Trey Scott's influence on Devontae Wyatt probably made him into a first-round pick. And other guys like Justin Greene are saying that right now too. So when you think about Georgia winning another major recruiting battle, obviously you celebrate that by adding Justin Greene here to this 2024 class. Always important to get good defensive linemen. Make sure you pay attention to one of the assistant coaches who's helping and making that happen. Obviously, Trey Scott doing good work there. Now, all of this comes just a few hours after Georgia got some bad news in the recruiting trail yesterday there as well. Sammy Brown, five-star linebacker, really from just down the road in Jefferson, Georgia. He chose Clemson. Listen, a lot of folks kind of knew that Clemson was going to be a major factor in his recruitment. I'll tell you, as a Georgia fan growing up, going to games, I lived in Hall County. We'd go down 129 to get to Athens, and right there in Jefferson, very near Jefferson High School, we'd always stop and there's a place called Catherine's Kitchen. We used to stop and get breakfast every Saturday morning going to the games, and right there at the 85 exits right there where it was. And when we'd stop and go get breakfast there, there'd be Georgia fans in there getting breakfast before they were going down to Athens there as well, but there were also a bunch of Clemson fans usually in there too on their way up 85 to go to Clemson. And so if you want to get an idea of kind of where Jefferson sits, it's just a few miles down the road from Athens, but it's also just a few miles south, basically down 85 from where Clemson is. So Clemson's always kind of been a little bit of a geographic factor when it comes to stuff like that. Sammy Brown's kind of always had an interest in Clemson. I think that Sammy Brown's a really good player, and I would have really, really, really liked to have him in this Georgia class for 2024. I think most Georgia fans probably would. I wish him well going there to Clemson. Unfortunately, I think when you have won as many linebacker recruiting battles as Georgia has won in last couple of years, certainly, I don't know that there's any program that has any more depth in its linebacker situation right now with its linebacker group than Georgia currently does. I think that made the Brown recruitment a little bit more difficult. I do. I think that Clemson would have been a factor no matter what, but I think the depth that Georgia has at the linebacker situation probably makes that even more of a challenging recruiting win for Georgia. Ultimately, there are recruiting battles in this 2024 class that are going to be more important for Georgia than another great linebacker. So I've stood on the table for Sammy Brown as a player plenty of times, even with the success that Georgia's had recruiting the linebacker position. Sammy Brown's always been a guy that I would like to have seen at UGA. That's ultimately not going to happen. He's going to Clemson. I think that Georgia's going to turn its attention now to players that probably needs more than maybe it needed Sammy Brown, and so we'll see if Brown and Georgia meet up on the field sometime in the near future and kind of see what happens with all that goes down. Clemson's going to be a factor for guys like this, and Brown made his choice. We wish him well with that, and we turn our attention for Georgia for the guys that it needs to finish off its 2024 class. And the good news for the Dogs here this morning, a major piece kind of has fallen into place. Justin Greene, big-time defensive lineman. The Dogs, who have the number one class right now in the class of 2024, also displaying some momentum. Some of that momentum kind of coming into fruition here, and Georgia fans are certainly going to like all of that. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We're glad to have you with us no matter how you get to us. 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're all across all kinds of video platforms. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 96 The Ref. We're available as a podcast, Apple, Spotify. We post the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com. Everywhere else that you kind of find podcasts, you can also find DawgNation Daily, and we're really happy to be able to do that with all of you today. Big thanks to our friends as well, Engineered Solutions of Georgia, who make it all possible. Listen, I know you've heard me talking about Engineered Solutions of Georgia for a long time here on the show, and I think maybe some of you kind of wonder, okay, well, when is Engineered Solutions of Georgia the right phone call for me to make? Well, you look around your home, you see evidence of certain things, and that evidence is going to be kind of a cue to you of, oh yeah, BA said, if I saw this, it's time to reach out to our friends at ESOG. So if you see that kind of 45-degree angle crack sometimes in your sheetrock, it's one of those things where, like, if it's kind of moving its way like this, then you kind of know, well, that's not quite how it's supposed to look. That 45-degree angle, that kind of, crossways kind of crack there, that's potentially the sign of a foundation issue. And that's a cue to you to give our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia a call. Or if you got those stair-step cracks in your brick, you know what I'm talking about, where it kind of just kind of sort of looks like stair steps there a little bit. Well, that's also, once again, a signal that, hey, at least finding out what's going on here from our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, that's probably the right thing to do. Plus, if you see that water leaking into your basement, frankly, you know that. You don't need me to tell you that. You already know that's the kind of thing that you got to have seen about, because water left unchecked over time can do a lot of damage. So if you get that water creeping in where it's not supposed to be, once again, that's a signal to you to call our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Any of those things, pick up the phone, kind of find out a company that's been in business and a solutions-based company for more than 15 years. They're locally owned. They've got an entire team of engineers on staff ready to do great work for you. There's really nobody else in our marketplace that can dedicate that kind of resource to solve those problems for you. That is what Engineered Solutions of Georgia is all about. They're also a proud partner of UGA Athletics. It's fun to support those that support the Dogs. That is what Engineered Solutions of Georgia does there as well. So make sure you give them a call. 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now, and use them as a great resource as a solution for your foundation, your waterproofing issues. Make sure you check out Engineered Solutions of Georgia today. All right, we're going to talk to Connor Riley here in a couple of minutes. That's going to be really fun. I'm going to give you an update on a great DawgNation contest we're currently doing right now. That's going to be really fun there as well. So we've got a lot of business to take care of as it relates to all of that. Prior to that, though, I'm going to go around the DawgHouse. And almost this never happens, but yesterday it did. I guess I was kind of fired up about the Kirk Herbstreit stuff off the top of yesterday's show. And if you haven't heard that yet, I hope you'll go back and listen to that. We were talking about what I thought was a fairly asinine line of logic from Herbstreit about Georgia a year ago and his belief now that Georgia, as he says it, right now only the third best team in the SEC on paper, that LSU, who Georgia manhandled in last year's SEC championship, literally, and Alabama are a little bit ahead of Georgia, he said. We thought that was pretty ridiculous, and so we kind of gave Herbstreit a little bit of grief for that yesterday. Kirk's a guy that, generally speaking, I think I kind of like. I think he's, a fun analyst, and there have been plenty of times over the years when Herbstreit's been pro-Georgia, but we're not going to let, nonsense stand just because he's been good to UGA in the past. What we thought he said was, frankly, pretty ridiculous, and we called him out on that. But what I intended to also make as a part of yesterday's conversation was something that Kirby Smart had said last week. Smart was at the SEC spring meetings in Destin, Florida. He's talking about a number of subjects. Some of that we're going to kind of get more into in the days ahead. But one of the questions that Smart was asked after 2 straight national championships, one of the teams that Herbstreit mentions that he thinks is better than Georgia right now, Alabama, if Kirby thinks that his team has actually kind of finally put Alabama in its rearview mirror and actually kind of surpassed Alabama as a program. And if those comparisons that media types, certainly like I've been guilty of this, a lot of media types kind of want to do the Georgia-Alabama comparison. If Kirby kind of thinks he's kind of finally kind of moved ahead and moved past Alabama as a program. And Kirby Smart says, well, listen, I'm not quite so sure that I, have been a part of some of these comparisons as much as some of y'all think, and ultimately kind of went on to talk about what matters to him when it comes to a comparison with Georgia and Alabama or Georgia and anybody else. This is actually good stuff as an addendum to what we were talking about yesterday. I meant to include it as a part of yesterday's show, but we'll do it here right now. Kirby on what he kind of does not really think is a very relevant comparison between his team and Alabama. This is what Kirby Smart said.
First off, I don't hear that a lot. Second of all, I don't measure our program based on their program. I mean, we measure our program based on the best we can do, and we try to do the best job we can each and every year. Our success is based on how we work out, how we perform, how we run, how we turn over the ball, how we convert third down. I mean, it's really that simple. It's not based on another program. I have the utmost respect for Nick and Alabama and everything they've done, but that doesn't have anything to do with us. And the focus for us has got to be on us.
Obviously, what Kirby Smart says there is just undeniably true that Georgia doesn't have a goal to be like another program because, frankly, there's no program better than Georgia. That Georgia's goal is being the best version of itself that it can be. And, I think now, look, if you want to go back to 2017, 2018, when Alabama was ending Georgia's seasons for the most part. Obviously, the 2017 national championship game, that was true, and for the most part, that was true in the 2018 SEC championship there as well. But if you want to go back to that time when Alabama was ending the Georgia seasons, then making the comparison between Georgia and Alabama was obviously an appropriate thing to do. If you want to go back to the conclusion of the 2021 season, there is no doubt, every Georgia fan I think would admit this, that Georgia getting over the hump and winning that first national championship, I think, was made more special because it was Alabama that Georgia beat to do that. There was a symbolic value in all of that. And I think at the time we sort of assumed there would be plenty more moments in which Georgia and Alabama would do battle, and maybe Alabama would be better than Georgia one year, maybe Georgia would be better than Alabama in one year, but in some form or fashion, these teams are going to kind of keep battling plenty more times in the future. And maybe that's still going to happen. Honestly, none of us can accurately predict the future totally. We don't really know what the future holds necessarily. But for now, I think it's important to understand from a narrative standpoint that Georgia and Alabama is currently not really a very appropriate comparison. As it stands right now, Georgia won't play Alabama in the regular season, and if Georgia's going to play Alabama at some point in the postseason, then Alabama's got some work to do. A much more accurate comparison right now, a much more reflective narrative right now in terms of what is actually going on in college football is to compare Alabama to a program like LSU, because it was Alabama losing to LSU a year ago that rendered any kind of comparison with Georgia moot, because Georgia's moving on to a national championship while Alabama is sort of watching the college football playoff there on TV. So at this point in time, I think it's actually somewhat insulting to Georgia to even ask the question of how do you measure yourself, compare yourself to Alabama. Right now, Georgia measures itself, compares itself to teams that were actually in the college football playoff, and this past year, Alabama wasn't. Now, maybe Kirk Herbstreit, who we kind of heard from yesterday, maybe he turns out to be right. Maybe Alabama will be just right back there in the discussion, and maybe Alabama kind of proves itself to once again be the number one potential stumbling block standing in the way of Georgia. Maybe that's the way all this is going to play out here this year. But it's not obvious that's going to be the case. And so when Kirby Smart says, hey, right now, we're just trying to be the best version of ourselves we can be, that's not just coach speak. Any kind of comparison with Alabama right now is, I think, somewhat irrelevant, just given the fact that this past year, Alabama was not a playoff team, and it's not obvious they're going to be one there again. So interesting words from Kirby Smart on a topic that a lot of media types just don't want to let die, whether Alabama's good enough to warrant the comparison there or not. But nonetheless, we'll make that around the DawgHouse here today. Now, before we bring on Connor Riley, let me also give you an update on a contest that hopefully you've submitted an entry for, and if you have not done so, maybe you still have time to do that between now and June 17th to get involved in our Celebrate American Heroes event we have going on courtesy of our friends at Kroger and Traeger Grills. Now, I love this because I love America. I love American heroes, and we've just kind of come off of the Memorial Day holiday, which we observe in honor of those who gave their life to our country, and we're also coming up on July 4th, which is Independence Day and our nation's birthday, and the time of year in which we're sort of thinking about all of the things that make America great. But for me, I would say one of the things that truly makes our country great are not necessarily the famous stories of true heroism, but it's sort of the everyday folks who just make our life better. Those are the kind of American heroes that we interact with on a regular basis, and you know so many of those people, and telling the story of one of those people may also make you a winner, courtesy of Traeger and Kroger. Traeger's going to give away an Ironwood XL grill. Kroger's going to give away a $500 gift card to somebody who tells a great story about someone who's been an American hero in their own life. So here's what you do. If you go to DawgNation.com, you can upload a photo, you can share a short video, which will stand as your entry into this contest, the story that you tell of an everyday American hero that's impacted your life. It's fun to celebrate folks like this. It's also fun to be a big winner, which you could be, courtesy of Traeger Grills and Kroger. So the contest is ongoing right now. Entries accepted up to June 17th. So please go to the top of the page at DawgNation.com. You can click in there. You can find out more about this. You can upload your entry, and you can be a part of what we have going on there. So big thanks to our friends at Traeger Grills. That Ironwood XL grill is going to be great for somebody. And that $500 gift card from Kroger is going to be really good, too, to put food on that grill. So some really exciting stuff going on. DawgNation.com for more details on that. Between now and June 17th, your chance to enter. All right, so a lot's going on here at UGA. Spring meetings last week in Destin, Florida. Big recruiting win for Georgia here today. A lot more on the horizon. Let's cover it all with Connor Riley. Here's a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Had a chance to talk to Connor Riley this morning very early in light of the Justin Greene announcement, so happy to be able to do that again. Connor, I guess let's start with recruiting here for a moment, then we'll kind of get into some of the other stuff that's going on. How big is the addition of Justin Greene here for this class of 2024 for UGA?
I really think massive is a fair word to use here. Georgia needs defensive linemen in this class. It's the most important position, in my opinion, for this recruiting cycle. Trey Scott's a great developer of talent. He's shown he's a great recruiter. Landing Justin Greene, especially at this time in the process, I think it's huge for Georgia. Tremont Walthour, Zion Loeb, Warren Brinson, now DawgHouse are all seniors and probably off to the NFL after this season. And so you're going to need, you'd love it if some of the recruits they sign in this class to be, impactful players, guys that can get on the field day one. The biggest thing they need in this class is just raw bodies. And, Bear Alexander transferring out, Sean Washington transferring out does not help in that regard. So landing a player, just landing a defensive lineman, first and foremost, Greene being the first one in this class is huge. The fact that this guy is this good and a guy who I think, right now he's number 101 or number 108, depending on which recruiting service you look at, I think he's got a chance to climb that as he continues to get better because that's all he's really done in the past year. So for Trey Scott to win this recruiting battle, especially after coming in late, Georgia was admittedly a little behind at the start of this recruitment. For them to win Justin Greene coming off this big recruiting weekend, I don't think it can be understated just how big it is. I
said this before you joined, is that to me, the Georgia program strength right now is demonstrated by the quality of its position coaches. And if you gave me the choice of I can have the nicest stadium or I can have the best position coaches, if I can have the best weight room or the best position coaches, I want that human resource. I want those assistant coaches out there spanning the globe, looking for the best talent, developing the best talent. To me, the best part of Kirby Smart at Georgia, I believe, it's the position coaches that he's hired to kind of fill out this staff and the fact that he's retained so many of them. Trey Scott, to me, the latest example of that. I don't know that anything, Connor, demonstrates this program's strength more than guys like Trey Scott continuing to win battles like this, being great mentors to guys who go on to be first-round picks. This, to me, right now is what makes Georgia, Georgia.
Trey Scott, year 7 in the program. Glenn Schumann, year 8 in the program. Todd Hartley going into year 5 in the program. The fact that Del McGee, also year 8 going into the program. The fact that Georgia has been able to retain so many of these key assistants, I think is a big reason why, for the most part, Georgia's recruited the inside linebacker position extremely well. They've recruited the tight end position extremely well. They've recruited the defensive line position extremely well. When you're able to sell to stability at these positional coaching spots, defensive line, inside linebacker, tight end, it certainly makes guys feel a lot more comfortable about committing to your program. And to your point about, nicer stadium, nicer facilities, NIL money, things like that. Talking to guys like Trayvon Walker, Jordan Davis, Devontae Wyatt, even Jalen Carter when we got a chance to, they all raved about Trey Scott. There wasn't a whole lot of talk about NIL money or how nice the facilities here are at Georgia. They spoke loudly and clearly about just how important Trey Scott was in their development. All those guys are first-round picks, and that makes it a lot easier to recruit players like Justin Greene. You can go back in the DawgNation Daily archives to when I first started working there in 2018 and even 2019 to an extent, and there would have been a time where landing a player on the defensive line of Justin Greene's caliber would have been, the equivalent of landing a 5-star quarterback or a 5-star running back. Because Georgia, for a long time, was just not swimming in those waters. And so for us now to sort of be in a spot where Georgia lands a fringe top 100 defensive lineman, sort of, it's a win, but it's not being seen as this, big celebration across the fan base, I think speaks to what Trey Scott has been able to build here. And that goes back to, I think, your larger point about the importance of position coaches at Georgia.
Fair and balanced here for a moment. How bad is the loss of Sammy Brown? Not necessarily unforeseen that he would go to Clemson. That's obviously been a major factor in his recruitment. Plenty of people, I'm sure, probably predicted that from the onset. Brown did announce for Clemson yesterday. This is a guy that Georgia, I think, had tried to be all in on. How bad is the loss of Brown here for the Dogs?
That's not the word I would use. It's certainly an L in recruiting, and that happens from time to time. You're not going to sign every top prospect, but, go look at what they signed in last year's cycle. Raylan Wilson, C.J. Allen, Troy Bowles. It's going to be hard for Sammy Brown, as talented as he is, and he is extremely talented, to get on the field over those guys. Jalen Walker, in my opinion, he'd be the best player on at least 10 defenses in the SEC, and he's not even going to start this year. That inside linebacker room is absolutely loaded right now. And, you tweet yesterday about it. I thought, it takes a certain type of player and person to want to come in here and play right away. And knowing that you're going to have to work really hard. I think it speaks volumes about what Georgia got in the 2023 recruiting cycle. But it got 3 of those guys that know it's not going to be easy to get on the field, certainly in year 1 and maybe even in year 2. You look at a guy like Xavier Sorey, he was a 5-star prospect coming in. He's barely seen the field in his first 2 years at Georgia. And I think there's a good chance that maybe Sammy Brown would have followed a similar model. At Clemson, they have 2 really talented linebackers that are both draft eligible this year, Jeremiah Trotter and Barrett Carter. Those guys are going to be draft picks probably after this year, and so there is an easier path to the field there. But, Jeff Sintel has mentioned Carter before. You go back to that 2021 recruiting class, I'm sure we sat here on DawgNation Daily at that point and talked about what a loss that was and how much it stung. I know I've certainly written about it. Georgia rebounds and they go and get Jamon Dumas-Johnson and Shema Munden, who, as good as talented as Carter is, I don't think any Georgia fan would trade what Munden and Dumas-Johnson did last year for what Carter could potentially do. And so, it's a loss, sure. I'm sure there are a lot of fans that don't like it, that he went to Clemson just up the road, a team Georgia's going to see to open the 2024 season. But bad and loss is really even not necessarily, I think, a fair term here. Georgia's going to recruit really good inside linebackers in this class because they always do. I think it's a little bit similar to, Georgia sees Landon Thomas flip to Florida State. They turn around, they land Jaden Riddell, they land Colton Heinrich, they might land Carter Nelson out of Nebraska. They're going to be just fine at the inside linebacker position.
So I thought you got an interesting point at DawgNation.com about this, which is if you ask me across college football who's the most interesting team in the country right now, Clemson would be one of my most interesting teams because, honestly, I'm just not quite so sure how good they're going to be. They might be very good with the hire of Garrett Riley as offensive coordinator, or they might be kind of the team they sort of appeared to be the last couple of years, which is frankly just not very interesting and certainly not really in the college football playoff conversation. They're kind of a swing team to me right now. But the point that I think you brought up, which I think is pretty accurate, that when you look at how Clemson has continued to sort of recruit the state of Georgia, winning Sammy Brown, it's a big battle for them. That's a big win for them. I liked Vic Burley as a player a year ago. I like Stephon Green. They've been involved with some big enough names here still in the state of Georgia that, it's not a complete demise yet for them in the Dabo Swinney era. They haven't been very good offensively. Maybe Garrett Riley changes that. But, they are still a factor for big name in-state recruits, and you do got to give them a little bit of respect for that.
Clemson is a team that can't wait, I think, for the 12-team playoff to start. I don't think right now is constituted. They're good enough on a year-in-year basis just from a talent standpoint to win a 4-team playoff. I think, they haven't made the most of some of the talent they had. Obviously, the coaching turnover they had, losing Tony Elliott, losing Brent Venables, I think has set the program back a little bit. And you can go back to that 2021 season opener, I think, is an inflection point for both Georgia and Clemson. Georgia wins that game 10-3. And if the game Clemson, they play a little bit better, they probably could have won that day. Now, they would have had to play a lot better offensively because I think you could have left them out there all night and they still wouldn't have scored a touchdown. Mm-hmm. But, Georgia, since that game, is 29-1, and they've won back-to-back national titles. Clemson is 21-5, and that's still very good. If they're playing an SEC-type schedule and not beating up on a pie-soft ACC schedule, you wonder what that record might be. And so I think going forward, yes, I think Dabo Swinney has shown, to quote Mark Twain, rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. And so, they're still going to be a factor, but they're a team, in my opinion, that, they might be able to get to a Final Four in a 12-team playoff because of the talent they bring in and because of the schedule they play. But in a 14 playoff era, which we are still currently in, they've clearly got some ground to make up. Maybe the hire of Garrett Riley helps them do that, but they got a long way to go. And, as much as we sat and we've talked here about the quarterbacks, really since Justin Ross picked up that injury during, I think, at the end of the 2019 season, when is the last time they had really dynamic wide receiver play?
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me. You look at the way people talk about Georgia now, where I think a lot of people assume it's just going to be you insert Carson Beck, you keep this machine rolling. That's kind of how we used to talk about Clemson, where they went from Deshaun Watson to Kelly Bryant one-year stopover, and then Trevor Lawrence, and then DJ Uiagalelei, before we sort of found out that DJ Uiagalelei couldn't cut it quite there at Clemson. And now you look at, the way they used to talk about Georgia. Do they have the quarterback play? Do they have the elite wide receiver play? That's how they're talking about Clemson right now. So it's really interesting to me to see how these two programs have flipped, because 3-4 years ago, I think we would have been sitting here saying, yeah, Georgia's a team that would love to get into a 12-team playoff because they have the talent, to make potentially a deep run, but don't know if they have quite the goods to get to a 14 playoff yet. And so that's flipped in the last 2 years, and I'll be really interested in seeing how it goes going forward when we ultimately get to a 12-team playoff.
I want to change the subject, and I mean this straightforward, matter-of-factly. How many national championships would Georgia have to win, Connor, before someone would predict them to win the national championship in the preseason? And I mean this. Once again, it's an offseason where it sort of feels like 2 years ago of – it sort of seems like the most prominent voice in the sport. We had some fun at Kirk Herbstreit's expense yesterday, just not really seeming to acknowledge what Georgia has done over the course of the last two seasons. I find it amazing that here we are in another offseason where it seems like Georgia's earning some skepticism, even though they've laid waste to college football for 2 straight years.
Follow me on this, because I'm going to say they need to win 2 more to sort of get to that Alabama level of just pencil them in as the title favorite every year, which is essentially what Kirk Herbstreit is doing. If you go back and look at the comments he made last offseason, he essentially echoed the same thing of, Alabama's going to be the hungrier team because they didn't end last season the way they wanted to. And we saw how that played out. They weren't hungry. If anything, they were pretty clearly less hungry, and lucky that I think Bryce Young bailed them out in the manner in which he did in a lot of close games last season. So, this year I think Georgia does, in a rational sense, I think enter as a title favorite, and I wouldn't be surprised if they win. I think what will be interesting is a year from now, they lose a lot of key contributors off this team, off this program going forward. And so I think, they probably need one more to really, hammer it home. And if they do win 3 straight, it'll be unprecedented. It's never been done in the history of the AP poll era. And so I'll be interested in seeing how that goes. But if they can get a 4th under Kirby Smart, the list of coaches that have won 4 national titles is incredibly small. Real national titles anyway, and the fact that he'll have done that in a college football playoff era where you're playing more games, you're playing more elite teams, and it's just that much harder to win. I think when you get to that 4 threshold, that's wild as that is to sound to believe, because, 3 years ago, if you had told us, Georgia's going to win 2 national championships back-to-back, you and I would have run to the podium to sign that form. And so, 2 more, I think, ends and answers any all questions. And I would point out as well, I think part of this, too, is just the deferential that Herbstreit has to Nick Saban. And Saban, in some respect, has earned that. But, if Saban, say, retires after this year, they don't win a national title, and Alabama undergoes further coaching change and turnover, I think maybe then you start asking that question of, okay, well, Georgia's pretty clearly the best team, and they don't have Nick Saban hanging around anymore. So what is Alabama? And pretty clearly that's going to swing in the favor of Georgia. So my
Nick Saban-related conspiracy theory is that the kind of present tense nostalgia we see for Nick Saban kind of playing out right now, a lot of the writers or commentators, things like that, they've been covering Nick Saban for such a long time, they can kind of remember when Saban's dominance first started back when they were young. And I think there's a thought that if Saban's still on top in college football, that means I'm still young. I feel like that's a lot of the love for Saban, kind of where it comes from, that, hey, life hasn't changed too much if Nick Saban's still on top in college football. But I know you wrote about this at DawgNation.com as well. The fact that Kirby Smart's even still being asked about comparison with Alabama when Alabama lost 2 regular season games a year ago. That to me is also a little bit of an insult here. And, last year you had unanimous assumption that Georgia was going to be behind both Ohio State and Alabama. Georgia was preseason number 3. And now you've got a guy like Herbstreit saying that he would take Georgia right now as the 3rd best team in the SEC. I mean, I think if you're a Georgia fan and you're bothered by that, I think you have a right to be. Now, most of this is just kind of, for fun, and we just sort of find things to argue about and, kind of do that as a little bit of a sport. But, I do think it's fair to call out the just sort of, I guess, the way in which some of these opinions right now just incredibly miss the mark.
Since 2019, do you know who has more losses between Georgia and Alabama?
Tell us.
It's Alabama. They've lost more games in the last 4 years. A pretty, I would say, significant sample size. You could have a player who's come into college, played all 4 years, graduated, gone on to be an NFL draft pick. Nolan Smith comes to mind there over the course of his college career. Alabama lost more times than Georgia did. And so I think you're right. There is a certain nostalgia, a reverence of looking back. I mean, I've said it before. Since Kirby Smart left Alabama, Georgia has won the same amount of national titles as Alabama has. And one of those, and look, I've been as high on that 2020 Alabama team as anyone. I think they beat 2019 LSU in a neutral field. But I think you do have to recognize that year was just so different. Yeah. And I've said the NBA title that year was the Mickey Mouse title. If you want to go that far and say that about Alabama's 2020 title, go ahead. I'm sure certain Georgia fans have out there. I'm sure Alabama fans are pulling their hair out listening to me right now. And why they're listening to DawgNation Daily, I have no idea. But largely, I think you're right in the sense that, this is sort of a long tail sort of thinking with Alabama of, this is the program that, they were a decade ago, or even in, say, 2015, 2016, when they win a national title in 15 and come very close to winning again in 16. And the reality is, what has Alabama shown you to do that? And again, look, Kirk Herbstreit is as good as it gets in this business. He's a very good commentator. Alabama just lost the number 1 overall offensive player in the country in Bryce Young, who went to the NFL, and the number 1 defensive player in Will Anderson. I know they've recruited really well. I don't know how you get better losing players of that caliber. And I'm sure they're going to go out here and show us this year. I think right now, if I had to pick, look, I was someone in January who was on LSU. There are way too many people on LSU right now, so I have my concerns there about that. I think Alabama, they've got to go out there and show and prove it that this is a program that they are who they were 5-6 years ago, because the team we've seen, certainly the last 2 years, is just not that same caliber of Alabama program. And so I think Saban has to go out there and show that this program is getting back to that. And with the quarterback questions they have right now, with the offensive line having a lot to play up to in terms of where they have been of late, there are just a lot of questions for me about Alabama. And I do think to an extent, because of who they were for the past decade, they are getting a little bit of a pass in terms of how some people talk about them in the media.
Final thing, I want to backtrack here for a minute. I was gone last week. I'm sure you had plenty of chance to weigh in on this. The SEC staying at an 8-game conference slate for 2024. With the door open to make the change prior to 2025, kind of a long-term change taking place after that. What do you make of all of this here right now, Connor?
So you had a tweet about this that I saw last night while you were on vacation, and I actually, saying, ESPN should give the SEC more money. I actually put a lot of this on Greg Sankey, and I think this is, and I don't want this word to get, lost in the shuffle because we throw it around a lot. I think it's a failure on Greg Sankey's part. It goes back to, okay, you sign this television contract, and then you bring in Texas and Oklahoma. That's a very bad order of operations right there. The move should have been made. You bring in Texas and Oklahoma first, and then you negotiate that TV deal. I think all that we have seen play out over the last 2 years, and which is stunning that it's taken 2 years for them to even come to some semblance of agreement on a schedule model, I think is a reflection of, in my opinion, poor leadership. And so, look, he's got a really tough job trying to wrangle 14 and ultimately soon 16 SEC programs. If I'm ESPN, I negotiated a deal with you. It's not my fault that you go out and add more teams and try to add more value after you sign a contract with us. And so I don't believe that ESPN should be trying to fork over more money to play more SEC games. And quite frankly, the fact that there's so much infighting with, with the way that this schedule thing has played out of certain teams want 8 games, certain teams want 9 games, and it seems like it's really split. I mean, that's just 4 or 5 years ago, heck, even going back to the Mike Slive era, it seems pretty wild that you would have certainly that level of public leakage of fracturing sides, and the fact that this has continued to go on like this, and you have continued to put a target on your back, I think is really just reflective of the SEC not necessarily having the leadership that it needs to get through this and foster this. I get he's got to answer to the presidents. I get the ADs are the ones that are making these decisions, and he is ultimately speaking for them. But I think you and I both agree, just go to 9 games and figure it out, and that's easier to say for Georgia when, you know, they want to play more big-time games and they have the talent to win more of those big-time games. But the fact that we've been talking for so long about this and are going to have to continue to talk about this because they've already made it clear that this is a one-year holdover, I think just really reflects poorly not on the ESPN side of this, but on the leadership of Greg Sankey and really the leadership of the conference as a whole.
That's an interesting way of looking at this. I guess the way I'll say it is because I do think that the ball is in ESPN's court here. Like, if you want better inventory, if you want more inventory, then I think you have to pay for it. Like we are in a time now in which all pretense of this being anything other than a business is completely stripped away. So holding out for every dollar you might be able to get, because there was sort of a prorated consideration for Texas and Oklahoma coming into the SEC. So it seems like there could still be room for saying, okay, well, how about we prorate additional conference, inventory that we would provide for you. So, to me, the ball is in ESPN's court here. But putting that aside for a moment, whether you kind of blame Sankey for this or you blame ESPN for kind of withholding additional finances here, I think it is going to be a little bit of a travesty if, like, say, 3 years from now, Texas and Oklahoma have been full-fledged members of the SEC for, going on a year, and this is only an 8-team conference slate. Like, something will have been lost from that. That means that we have traded great tradition, like Deep South's oldest rivalry, third Saturday in October. Even like Texas A&M wouldn't be played on a yearly basis either. Like if we add Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC, but don't hold on to the traditional rivalries that have been in place and don't, add these traditional rivalries that now could be in place, then to me that's just kind of a bungled thing where, like, you've made change for the sake of change. You've sort of thrown tradition in the trash, and you really haven't gotten much for it.
If the SEC sticks with, say, an 8-game model, and they decide that Georgia going to Texas A&M and Georgia going to Mississippi State and Georgia going to Missouri every year is more important than Georgia playing Auburn every year, we should just pack the sport up, because it's very clearly at that point trying to be, I guess, an inferior version of the NFL. And look, I've made it clear I prefer the NFL to college football, but what makes college football special is that Georgia-Auburn game. It is Tennessee-Alabama. Tennessee got its butt kicked by Alabama for, 13 straight years, maybe 14, 15 straight years, an incredibly long amount of time. They win last year, and you see how much that game means to them. And the idea that you're going to take that away so that Tennessee can go play at Oklahoma and Florida can go play Arkansas more often, I just think that's a terrible, short-sighted idea of trying to satisfy, people outside of your footprint. Like, sure, Georgia fans would love to go to Texas A&M once more than every 12 years. But at the same point in time, if that means taking away Georgia-Auburn, taking away, marquee games like Tennessee-Florida, I think that's incredibly short-sighted and ultimately going to hurt your product, because those big games, those big rivalry games are what draw fans in on a yearly basis. Like Texas A&M is not going to be good every year. Georgia may eventually be a down program. It'll be a long time from now, and you and I will both probably be long gone from this earth. But, Georgia-Florida is always going to mean something. Georgia-Auburn is always going to mean something to the people invested in both sides of that. If we're just willing to trade that in and not keep that on the schedule, I just think that's incredibly wrong. And again, reflects poorly on not just the leadership of Sankey, but the leadership of the SEC as a whole, and potentially how out of touch they would be, I think, with their alumni, with the people who root for their university, with sort of, again, you're right to call this a business, with their consumers.
Yeah, so quick final point for me on this, and we'll wrap up. I remember being on the air, SEC Media Days week, going back a couple of years ago when this first came to light that Texas and Oklahoma are going to be in this league. And kind of the thing that struck me about it then, and I still remember it now, is just how little excitement there was about it. I didn't hear a ton of excitement coming from the Texas Oklahoma camps. Certainly Georgia fans were not that excited about this kind of annexation of two big powers. There was a lot of curiosity, but what does this mean? A lot of interest in the story, of course, but in terms of people thinking, oh, the SEC had flexed by going out and getting these two big schools. There wasn't a ton of that. There was a lot of, I'm not quite so sure this is what I want the SEC to be. So I think in light of what you're saying and in light of kind of what I'm saying, I do think this is a moment for SEC leadership to be very careful here, that you've got a way to potentially make your league better, but you could also make this league kind of lose some of what's made it special if you're not careful how you handle your business here over the course of the next year. Would you agree with that?
I do. It goes back to, again, when we get into, the R.S. Andrews pick show we do over the year, we have games where, it's easy to be like a big SEC fan, but then like you're a real SEC fan if you're excited to see like how South Carolina, Tennessee play each other, Arkansas, Texas A&M, those kinds of games. And those games are, I think, what give the SEC its identity, that you're going to have two physical games between teams that, have plenty of talent. If you put them in another conference, I think they're capable of making a run, potentially winning a lesser conference. But if you're just trying to grab the biggest and best powers, going out and grabbing Texas and Oklahoma, I mean, it certainly makes your league deeper. But again, like, I don't know how the SEC gets any better than it already is. Its conference champion is almost always the favorite to win a national title. They've had, if I'm doing the math here correctly off the top of my head, which is always dangerous, they've had 3 different champions from this conference. No other conference has had more than 1 champion from their conference. And so you look at it that way. Look, this league's already incredibly deep. Making it even deeper, like, what does that accomplish? Sure, going to Austin will be cool. Going to Norman will be cool. Playing Oklahoma, whatever. Georgia was already scheduling those games. They're already going to go play. They were supposed to play at Oklahoma this year, and that game got canceled because of the SEC. They were supposed to go play at Texas in a few years. You're going to see those types of games. And so, adding them to the league, we'll ultimately see if it's a net good. I'm skeptical of it. And so, ultimately, again, Greg Sankey's first comment said we're not going to let money dictate that. I find that incredibly laughable. All of this comes back to money.
Right.
All of this has been done in the name of the almighty dollar. And so, just be honest and say, yeah, we're trying to make as much money here as we can. And I think most college fans will understand that. It's no longer about the rivalries. It's no longer about the big Saturday tailgates. It's just about these schools getting as much money as they can.
Connor, fascinating stuff. We always love the conversation. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia today. We'll look forward to reading a lot more from you at DawgNation.com and, of course, talking to you very soon there as well.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I think what Connor says there is kind of an interesting point, basically in terms of how do we get to a scheduling model for the SEC that most people kind of view as unsatisfactory. The majority of folks, I think, view as unsatisfactory. How do we get here? I kind of put the blame more on ESPN for what I think is, kind of some closed purses at the moment. Connor puts the blame on Greg Sankey. Let me take what Connor says at face value for a moment just to say this. That moving forward, this game becomes a whole lot more about chess than it does, I don't know, Battleship or something like that. Like you can't win with strength alone. You can't win with just sheer raw power alone. You do have to strategize a little bit, and you do have to kind of play the strategy out here a little bit because, the SEC saw the option to swoop in and grab Texas and Oklahoma. That's what it did. Well, the Big Ten responded. They swooped in, they grabbed USC and UCLA, and that's adding the kind of 2 big LA powers to a league in the Big Ten that already had, the makings of a more lucrative media rights contract, because as we said before, Big Ten states, just generally speaking, are a little bit bigger. Big Ten alumni bases are generally speaking a little bit bigger, and so therefore you add 2 big schools, 2 LA schools, UCLA and USC, into the fold there for the Big Ten. And so now for the SEC, you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we respond? What's our next move on the basis of what, the Big Ten has done? And it's not obvious that there's another conference expansion play for the SEC to make. Look at the situation in the ACC for a moment, where there are clearly some teams like Florida State and Clemson that want out of the ACC. But legally speaking, it's not obvious to me, based on the stuff that I've read, that they could break the contract they currently have with the ACC. And even if they were on the open market, this is where things get tricky. To me, it seems like a Florida State or a Clemson or maybe even a Miami, that those programs would have a lot more value to the Big Ten than they would to the SEC, because the fact that the SEC is already prevalent in South Carolina. And it's already prevalent in Florida, even in that sort of Florida panhandle area where Tallahassee's located. That I don't know that the SEC would gain as much value from bringing in Florida State and Clemson the way that the Big Ten would, because this is the Big Ten now moving into an area in the country which they're not currently located. So once again, this becomes about strategy and moves not necessarily being obvious, but how you keep pace financially is going to really matter, especially in some sort of future world where it is not that hard to conceive, even like I'm talking about in the short-term future, that one of these days that football players may be classified as employees. And if they're employees, they don't necessarily work for the university. They may be working for the conference. And if you're a conference that has more revenue coming in, you have more ability to pay the players. And so therefore, keeping pace financially with the Big Ten is a very important job for the SEC. And sheer raw strength and power alone, or sheer ambition alone, is not going to be enough. You got to have some careful strategizing here. And that puts a lot of a challenge at the feet of Greg Sankey. We'll see how that plays out. For now, though, no strategy to worry about here, just simply straightforward from this point when it comes to our friends at Royal Caribbean and cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I can promise you that if you make the decision here, summer 2023, looking towards the end of this year, early 2024, when you start thinking about all those things, making your plans for a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation will never be a mistake. It'll be the kind of thing that you will be very glad you did. So take time to reach out to Jessica Slater. She's a great travel agent. You can call her 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Let her tell you about everything that's on the slate here for Royal Caribbean, including, you've heard me talk about it before, and we're getting closer to the debut, beginning of next year, January of 2024. I'm talking about Icon of the Seas. And I continue to hear things about Icon. It's going to be a brand new ship, brand new category of ship, debuting for Royal Caribbean. And it's really going to redefine the cruise, I think, vacation experience, because it's going to have the largest water park at sea. It's going to have an entire collection of entertainment options unlike anything before. You're going to have, I think, Wizard of Oz, I believe, is the wonderful, Broadway-style production they're going to make available. It's just the kind of amazing stuff. I've seen some of the bar and restaurant concepts they're going to have. I mean, it's such a big step forward for the cruise industry, and everybody's excited about it. And you have a chance to be one of the first to sail on it. So give Jessica a call. She can tell you about Icon of the Seas. Or if you can't wait until January to take your next Royal Caribbean cruise, or maybe your first Royal Caribbean cruise, then all the better time to be planning all of that right now. Great to be cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I'm going to cheat here a little bit. I'm going to put some Georgia-themed stories into our SEC through here for a moment, including the Diamond Dogs yesterday announcing that Wes Johnson, the pitching coach at LSU, has been hired as Georgia's baseball coach. Somebody asked me before the show started today, what do I think about Johnson now as the Georgia baseball coach? The honest answer is, I guess I just don't really know. This is an example of you can go proven head coach at kind of the lower level. I had sort of had my eye on the Campbell coach a little bit, which I know we're getting deep in the weeds here on college baseball if we're talking about the Campbell Camels, but I'd sort of followed them a little bit this year. You know how these coaching searches go. You sort of kind of like get your name, or you sort of find an attachment to some guy, and that becomes your guy that you sort of ride with. And that the Campbell coach, whatever his name is, I'm not even really sure. He had been kind of my guy in all of this. That's the guy I sort of hoped that Georgia would hire. I have no reason to think that Johnson's going to be a bad coach. Obviously, the foundation, much like we talked earlier in the program, defensive line kind of being the foundation of college football. Well, the foundation of baseball is always going to be good pitching. The guy coming from LSU here has got a background with pitching. He's worked in Major League Baseball. You kind of like that. There has been some reporting out there. There's a guy named Kendall Rogers who covers college baseball for a website called D1 Baseball, probably the most prominent website covering college baseball. Kendall Rogers is probably the most prominent college baseball reporter. He had said that he had kind of heard that Georgia was, kind of not necessarily looking to pay top dollar for this baseball coach. I don't know if that's true or not. I have no way of knowing that. I don't know where Rogers' sourcing would have come from on that, but that's a pretty prominent voice who was saying that, Georgia wasn't necessarily looking to spend as much as it possibly could to bring in this baseball coach. I guess the one thing I'd always kind of wonder, because we know that, going back to the UGA spring meetings the other day, we know that there's some big-time facility enhancements coming for Georgia baseball, that's been much needed, and Georgia's going to get that. Here's the one thing I guess I would kind of wonder. Long-term, over the course of the past, looking into the future, I wonder how much Georgia suffers from being so close to a major league team. the Atlanta Braves, because you look at LSU, big support from their fans. We got the box, whatever that stadium is. It's always full. A lot of money coming into LSU baseball. Also a long way from any kind of, you're probably the closest team's probably the Houston Astros, a couple hours down the road. That's not really a major league market. A lot of money kind of poured into LSU baseball. Same for Mississippi State. Same for Vanderbilt. Nashville, far removed from a major league team. Tennessee, kind of an example of that, where you have these SEC teams that play, in many cases, several hours away from the closest major league team. And so it seems like they get a level of baseball support that oftentimes doesn't exist here in Georgia, because a lot of big-time Georgia fans are also big-time Atlanta Braves fans. Their baseball itch gets scratched, so to speak, by Major League Baseball. And so therefore it seems like at times the passion of this fan base hasn't been as high for baseball as it is in places where you don't have that Major League Baseball team right there in your backyard to kind of support. This is all just speculation on my part, but it is one of those things I've kind of wondered about. Same thing for, in some respects, college basketball there as well. A lot of SEC teams play far removed from the NBA, but, Georgia's right in the backyard of a major, U.S. city that has, professional sports, across the entire landscape there. How much do the non-football sports at UGA suffer because of that? Because they kind of exist in the shadow of professional sports in a way that other SEC teams in more far-flung places, far removed from big city professional sports, that just doesn't quite exist. Maybe that's not a thing, but it's something I've kind of wondered about. And we'll tell you this, with the super regionals getting ready to begin, I'm jealous, man. I'm jealous of the fun that Tennessee fans get to have. We saw Texas A&M eliminated last night, but the fun that other SEC teams get to have. Florida, going to be in a super regional. You can kind of look, we're guaranteed of having an SEC team in the College World Series once again. I'm jealous of that. I've watched a lot of these NCAA regionals over the course of the last few days. I think it's a really fun. I think college baseball is such an underrated sport. It doesn't get nearly the attention that it deserves for whatever reason. ESPN has not chosen to give as much promotion of this, some of the other college athletics events that it's able to televise. College baseball can't quite seem to get as much attention from ESPN for whatever reason. But I wish it would get more attention. I think it's a great sport, and I think it deserves its spotlight here. And I hope that Georgia's a part of this in the future. So I don't know how good this baseball coach will be, but we certainly wish him well, and we'll certainly be behind him as he tries to resurrect a baseball program that it really has. Georgia has a pretty good history, and it's time to bring that good history back. Speaking of history, College Football Hall of Fame announced its candidates yesterday. A couple of Georgia names of note. Here's Richard Seymour, who just went to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Garrison Hurst in there as well, which is frankly kind of weird that Garrison Hurst isn't already in the College Football Hall of Fame. Of all the Halls of Fame, the College Football Hall of Fame is probably the strangest in terms of how you get in, who's not in. The criteria to me is always pretty weird. But this is also kind of cool from the standpoint that, Michael Vick is up in consideration this year. I think it'd be fun to see his Virginia Tech career honored. I think that'd be kind of a cool thing. There are actually some pretty Larry Fitzgerald is a part of this, obviously a great wide receiver from Pitt. There's actually a lot of cool names in consideration here, including Garrison Hurst and Richard Seymour, so we wish them well as they seek enshrinement in the College Football Hall of Fame, which now, as you know, is in Atlanta. And I briefly mentioned this yesterday, but I'll mention it now. So Netflix is going to have, late August, a documentary about Florida football. And it kind of covers the Urban Meyer era when Tim Tebow was there, and obviously Aaron Hernandez was there. I don't really know how impactful this is going to end up being. Obviously, it'll be the kind of thing we end up laughing about if it makes Florida look like a bad, kind of paints Florida in a bad light. But other than that, a lot of this is kind of a long time ago now. So it may be interesting TV, but does it really move the needle, move the meter very much? I guess it depends on how salacious some of this documentary stuff ends up being. Maybe the most interesting aspect of this is, if the documentary goes the way that I think some people think it's going to, sort of casting that era of Florida football in kind of a negative light, certainly an interesting light, maybe potentially a negative light, just given some of the Aaron Hernandez-related stuff that kind of went on there. To me, this is going to further tarnish what has become a little bit of, the reputation that Urban Meyer has as a coach. Have you seen anyone's coaching star fall so fast? It's really kind of amazing that when, Meyer left Florida, this was as big a coach as anyone could have possibly hired. Ohio State hires him, and he goes on to have great success there. I think he kind of introduced a brand of SEC-style football and SEC-style recruiting there to Ohio State. Listen, there's a lot about Meyer that you've kind of not always liked over the years, but you would have thought of him as one of the big-time coaches in college football. And you want to go back to, like, 2014 when Meyer's Ohio State team was beating Nick Saban's Alabama team in the college football playoff. It was sort of Meyer and Saban sort of thought of as side-by-side. That when you talk about the best coaches in college football, it was not Nick Saban by himself the way that it kind of was for many years after that. It was Saban or Meyer. These were the sort of the two top guys. Well, since then, obviously Nick Saban's kind of grown in his coaching stature. And since Meyer became the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, a lot of reconsideration has taken place on Meyer. And kind of looking back on his time at Ohio State, a lot of that wasn't very favorable to him. His behavior while Jacksonville Jaguars coach, that did not paint himself in a very strong light. And now they're going to kind of go back and reconsider some of his time at Florida there too. It's been an interesting watch here over the course of the last couple of years, watching the Meyer coaching star fall. And there may be more falling to take place if this Netflix documentary kind of plays out the way that many of us think that it might. We will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. So speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, obviously we think they've got a pretty tough game coming up to begin this upcoming season against the Utah Utes, having to go to Salt Lake City. Jarring to see an SEC team, about a double-digit favorite. It's about 9.5, 10-point number right now. Early look-ahead line has Utah favored over Florida. So Georgia fans may get a chance to see Florida really kind of manhandled to begin the season. Some Georgia fans already thinking about that. We'll do this as a golden shoe today. I thought this was really funny. Brant Evans shares this. I love this. He says, I'm in Salt Lake City grading AP exams, and I had to take an early morning run to the location where the Gators are going to start 0-1 this year. Golden shoe worthy, he asks. Brant, you better believe that's the case. He's there at Utah Stadium, Rice-Eccles Stadium as it's known, a place we think that Florida's going to lose to begin the season. Brant, that's really funny. Thank you for sharing that. We'll give you a golden shoe indeed. Very, very clever and creative. I love that. And we know that Florida's going to lose not just to Utah to begin the season, but also near the end of the season as well at the hand of the Georgia Bulldogs. In fact, that happens 144 days from right now. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We will see all of you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. They take care of your air conditioning unit, which is very important right now because you know how hot it is. And staying cool, job one here this summer in your AC unit, courtesy of R.S. Andrews, helps you do just that. All right, I'm going to start on Facebook today. We'll take some comments, and we'll see where it all goes from there. Hope you're all doing well today. Georgia gets a big recruiting win. Things are fun right now. We may try to do something a little bit. Jeff Sintel does not know this yet, but I may try to do something a little bit different with Jeff, just given the fact there's been so much going on with recruiting. We haven't really had a chance to talk about him with all that. We may do some of this here in a little bit. Let's see what else. Keith Fold says I do some weird things with my hands. I have become a little bit more of a hand talker. I don't know that I always used to be. I think it's just one of those things that sort of occurred over time. Like when you do TV, which is not really TV, but we are on camera, you're supposed to sort of sit here like this. You're supposed to sort of talk like that, and you're supposed to be very, very still. Like I've never been able to do that. I've always had a lot of nervous energy, and I think the nervous energy kind of comes out a lot of sort of weird hand motions. So I will take the L on that. Barry says maybe some ADHD. I think there is some of that. I think there is some of that, but it's also just one of those things where I don't know. It's like I just sort of become a little bit more of a hand talker than I probably used to be. I have kind of noticed that. Let's see what else is going on. Pete Williams says, I never really hear about Urban anymore unless it's from you. Well, there you go. Let's see what else. William Camacho on the subject of Richard Seymour. He was a beast on defense, and Hurst was a beast on offense. Yeah, I'd love to see both those guys going to the College Football Hall of Fame. Obviously, Richard Seymour just went to the Pro Football Hall of Fame and an amazing pro career. His pro career was probably better than his career at Georgia. You think you'd probably have to say. Garrison Hurst to me seems like a shoo-in. I believe that Hurst should have won the 1992 Heisman Trophy. That's always been a bone of contention for me. So yeah. Let's see what else. Bill Sanders says, let's not be too smart by half here. He says, college baseball isn't all that popular at Georgia because it isn't winning. Yeah, but you want to go back to the time in which Georgia was winning. I don't think I'm incorrect for saying that college baseball has always been bigger at certain places in the SEC than it has been at Georgia. Even when Georgia was winning, that was true, I think. And as I said before, I'm not quite so sure that this is the answer, but the one thing that you have to acknowledge is that Georgia lives in the shadow of professional sports in Atlanta in a way that most SEC teams just don't. I'm not going to tell you that's for sure, the answer here, but how come? When you say, well, how come Georgia has lagged in behind facilities? How come, if it is true that Georgia wouldn't want to pay top dollar for a coach? I think the assumption you have to make, if those things are true, is, well, the donors who are connected to this program don't want to pony up for that. And we say, well, why is that true? Why don't donors want to pay as much for Georgia baseball as maybe some other donors from other SEC programs do? If you had to think of an answer, maybe because those donors are busy going to the Braves games in the summer. Let's see what else. Steve Rogers remembering back to the 1990 College World Series. That was a lot of fun. I remember that. That's back when Mike Mussina was pitching for Stanford. Georgia Southern was also in that World Series there as well. Georgia ended up beating Oklahoma State, who at the time was a big-time power. Ended up beating, this is post-Robin Ventura, but Oklahoma State was a big-time power. Georgia beat him in the championship game. It was fun. Michael Ward says, as much as I'm not a Gator fan, I want them to represent the SEC well in Utah. Yeah, I can't quite root for Florida in that situation, but I understand where you're coming from. Kane Harris says, I shouldn't be spreading rumors if I don't know the facts about the Georgia baseball team. I'm not spreading rumors. What are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. If you're talking about what the guy reported, listen, that's just a report. I'm here to provide information. I can't, verify anything, but I'm here to provide information. Let's see what else. Over here on YouTube for a moment. Let's see what's going on over here on YouTube. Wally Smith says, what are the haters going to say when we win the national title this year? So I said this to Connor earlier. For whatever reason, it's actually way easier for Georgia to win the national championship than it is for Georgia to have somebody to predict them to win the national championship. It just seems like we've now had, 3 off seasons kind of leading into the last 2 years to actual Georgia national championships where there were, scarce predictions of UGA actually winning the national championship. I find that to be pretty strange. Reggie Fly says, are you surprised by the Sammy Brown news? It was obvious from the beginning. Obviously Clemson was always a major factor there, and it's not all that surprising necessarily that he went to Clemson, but I do think that Georgia was trying to recruit him hard. I do think that Georgia wanted him. Sometimes you just take the L there in that situation. Crow King 123 says, if Georgia wins a third national title, does that cement us as a college football blue blood? So I think the blue blood designation is always a little bit hard to, kind of truly define. But I believe that Georgia's well established as a blue blood. I think the last 2 national championships have certainly helped that. But, I think you have to right now view Georgia both historically and obviously in modern present times as, as certainly as prestigious a program as basically anybody. If you want to go back 20 years ago, that might not have been true, but obviously with what Kirby Smart has been able to do, now Georgia's accomplishments, I think, fare pretty favorably with almost anybody. Jonathan Aaron, no, my vacation was not to Destin, Florida. I did not come back with a big bag full of cash, unfortunately, no. Greg Rosenberg says, does anyone else like watching us win with great dual threat tight end play? I've calmed down a lot about wide receiver recruiting because I enjoy the tight end driven offense. Yeah, I enjoy the way Georgia plays for sure. Frank Patterson says, who do you think loses more games this year? The Shriners, which is Frank's word for Alabama, or Clemson? Yeah, I mean, I think that right now, I guess I'd probably favor Alabama to lose more games there, I think, just simply because of the fact that Clemson is still playing in the ACC. I don't believe they're probably better than Florida State, but they're probably still better than everybody else in that league. Tyson asking about the Texas-Alabama non-conference series compared to the Georgia-Oklahoma. The difference between the Texas-Alabama series and the Georgia-Oklahoma series is that Texas and Alabama are finishing their series prior to Texas joining the SEC, whereas Georgia would be starting its series with the other home game, Oklahoma coming to Georgia, slated to take place after Oklahoma was already in the SEC. So that's the difference, is that while Georgia and Oklahoma would have played this year with Oklahoma not yet in the SEC, the return date's not scheduled until another few years from now when Oklahoma would have already been in the SEC. So that's the difference between the Georgia-Oklahoma series and the Texas-Alabama series. Alabama and Texas were able to get both their games in prior to Texas joining the league. That would not have been true for Georgia and Oklahoma. Greg Rosenberg saying, I wonder if Schumann being an obvious short-time coach had anything to do with his decision. I mean, listen, I'm not going to tell you that Clemson's not a fair landing spot for a guy like Sammy Brown. I mean, it's not an unreasonable choice to go to a place like Clemson. They've had good defensive success. You know, obviously Brent Venables not there anymore, but that's been a good defensive program for a while. You know, the idea that Glenn Schumann's a short-term coach, maybe that's the case. I mean, I think he's probably fast-tracked to be a head coach, but he is making big bucks here at Georgia now, so, you know, it's not obvious that he's going to have to leave this year. I mean, I think one of the things you're seeing at Georgia right now, I think that Dan Lanning, you know, I mean, this is one of those things I kind of probably proved to be wrong at, where it's like, you know, I was of the belief, well, if Lanning could get the Kansas job, he should probably take that because you get a chance to be a Power 5 head coach. They're going to pay you enough money that you should jump at any Power 5 job you could probably get because just the amount of money that you would get for doing so makes it worth the decision. In Lanning's case, though, he actually held out for a better job at Oregon, and he's obviously benefiting from that. So I think you kind of, even though Lance Leipold at Kansas actually turned out to be a really good coach, and he may be on his way to a bigger job himself here in the very near future. But the point is that it worked out for Lanning to kind of hold out for the bigger job. I kind of wonder now if we're going to see more Georgia assistants kind of holding out for bigger opportunities and not necessarily jumping at the first thing they could get, because what you see with the NFL draft is an example of the fact that the elite talent in college football is kind of all migrating to a small number of places. There were very few Group of 5 draft picks this year. There was almost no FCS draft picks this year. That you know, because of the transfer portal and things like that, NFL-level players are leaving lower-tier programs and they're going to better places. And so I think that makes the unattractive jobs even more unattractive than they used to be because there just aren't NFL-level players going to those places or staying in those places very long, which means the kind of jobs that you would leave a place like Georgia for, that list is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So while it seems like Glenn Schumann is a fast-track guy to be a head coach, and I believe he probably is, Schumann's still really young. And because of the way in which college football seems to be changing, there's so many jobs that are just not all that attractive right now. A guy like Schumann may be truly intent, I'm just speculating here, but a guy like Schumann may be truly intent to really wait for a good one, much the way that Dan Lanning did. And we'll see how quickly something like that comes. Let's see what else. Andrew Hughes says, will it take a three-peat for UGA to garnish the respect of the mainstream sports media? Why do we draw so much ire for them? Yeah, I mean, as I said a moment ago, if you're a Georgia fan and you want to kind of be incredulous about the fact that another off season has come and few people, you know, the Reese Davises, the Kirk Herbstreits seem to be picking Georgia, I think you're very fair to feel that way. I do. Yeah, but eventually you win enough, you will be kind of what Alabama is now. The media will still be picking you even when it's not even appropriate to do so anymore. Like, you know, if you ever follow like real estate, things like that, by the time you read about a trend in the paper, the actual trends probably change. And I'm sure that Wall Street and stuff like that's the same way. I just happen to know about real estate a little bit more. That by the time you see the media talking about the market being up, the market being down, the market's actually probably changed again since these news reports have come out. And college football, I think, works the same way. By the time the media sort of recognizes the reigning power in college football, the actual balance of power may have shifted. Sometimes, to use your phrase, the mainstream media is just a little bit slow to notice. So now I believe you've got people like Kirk Herbstreit picking Alabama long after the shelf life has expired on the Crimson Tide. And one day Georgia will probably benefit from that too. And where you see a lot of this is like, well, so-and-so's an all SEC. Like Georgia's probably at the level now still where Georgia's got all SEC level performers that don't always get acknowledged that way because people haven't fully caught up to Georgia, even with 2 straight national championships. But 10 years from now, and I hate to say it this way, but it's probably going to be true, 10 years from now, Georgia's going to probably have all conference level players, or should say all conference players, who may not actually be playing at that level, but they just have the reputation of, well, that's a Georgia player. He must be good. We're going to give him an all conference thing. We've seen that in the SEC a lot, where some of the guys from, like, say, Alabama, times who've gotten the all-conference nod. If you ask an Alabama fan, they'll tell you, well, actually, so-and-so's a better player. It just so happens this guy gets the nod because that's where he plays. So eventually, if Georgia keeps doing what it's doing, eventually it'll become overrated. But that's going to probably take a while to get there. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark on the idea. He says, we earned this schedule. We whipped everything in sight. I give everybody a sporting chance. Yeah, to Spencer's point, at least slightly based on his point, like the one thing I don't think has been fully considered about Georgia. This is why, I've talked about this a few times. This is why I think it's a little bit frustrating not to see Georgia, I would say, fully acknowledged. Even I forget about this at times. The real story of Georgia's national championship last year is just how uncompetitive most of the season was. There are very few marches to a national championship that are as uncompetitive as most of Georgia's season was. Close call at Missouri, that truly happened. Knockdown, dragon against Ohio State, that truly happened. But y'all, that's what's supposed to happen. I mean, the idea that we're going to give Ohio State credit because, hey, they played Georgia close. You're Ohio State. You're supposed to play Georgia close. But the notion that was essentially the only actual real game that Georgia played, that along with Missouri, over the course of 15 games, and that the SEC championship was a laugher, the national championship was one of the most embarrassing lopsided games in college football history. The big everybody's like, oh, where's Georgia's big non-conference game? Well, if you want to say, hey, where's Georgia's big non-conference game, then you need to also say, like the one they won 49-3 the previous year. I don't. The thing that I don't think has been fully considered about Georgia is the way in which it has laid waste to so much of college football. Jay Shipe's still accusing me of getting people sick before the Peach Bowl. Jay, people are going to believe that if you keep saying that. Christopher Vale giving Dabo Swinney a hard time there, which is very funny. Let me go back to DawgNation.com, and then we'll kind of roll through all the comments here in a minute. Bill Russell says Alabama's going to lose to Texas and Auburn's signature win for Freeze. That's a big prediction. We did predict last week Texas to beat Alabama, and I believe that will happen. If Hugh Freeze beats Nick Saban again, which will be his third straight-up win against Saban, and gives that signature win to Auburn there, you're talking about a major change in the SEC West. That'll be a major change, and it'll be a major change quickly. Now, Gus had some, relatively mediocre Auburn teams that still beat Alabama. 2019 would be an example of that. But didn't they win in 2019? I think they did. But it would be a big deal for Freeze to win in year one. It'd be a huge deal. So big, strong prediction there from you. Randy Hall says, can anybody beat Oklahoma in softball? I guess I don't think so. I don't follow softball like I do some other sports. I will certainly admit that, although I do think it's a very interesting sport. I just don't happen to follow it that closely. But that team is amazingly dominant. By the way, Jacob Yarborough also talking about that Lousy Stinking Gators, which would be a great title for it on Netflix. DT on the idea of keeping rivalries. It's important to note that in 2024, when you do have the 8-game schedule, they are going to keep rivalries for that. So my understanding is that Georgia will play Auburn next season. I think even Texas and Texas A&M are going to play. Alabama's going to play Tennessee. They're going to show respect for traditional rivalries for next season's schedule. But the reason why you can't maintain your secondary rivalries when you move, if you were to move to a permanent 8-game schedule, is because the league wants you to play every team every 2 years. And they want you to travel to every stadium every 4 years. And so you've got to have a more rotational schedule in order to be able to do that. This is the SEC right now prioritizing what people haven't seen or haven't seen as frequently over what people have seen on a yearly basis. And I am not quite so sure that's changed for the better. I'm just not. I don't know that – I think we talked about this yesterday. I don't know that going to Texas A&M because you've never done it is somehow better than going to Columbia or Knoxville because you do that every other year. I think there's something to be said for familiarity. I really do. But the league doesn't agree with that right now. They want to provide either what hasn't happened before or what hasn't happened very frequently, and they want to provide that at the expense of some games they think that people have kind of grown tired of. So that's what that's about. They want to be able to play the entire league every 2 years, travel to every stadium every 4 years, and that requires dumping a lot of these secondary rivalries on a yearly basis if you want to stick with an 8-game schedule. Stick D's also kind of reminding us about it. We went live at the Orange Bowl for our post-game show, and they had the big Michigan-themed New Year's Eve party in the background that literally a bunch of Michigan booster types had rented out the Orange Bowl, or whatever it's called, Hard Rock Stadium, I guess it's called, for their big New Year's Eve party, thinking that was going to be this huge celebration for them, and obviously Georgia ruined that. Yeah, Stick, that's a funny memory. I'm glad you remember that. Rambo says, bottom line, UGA baseball needs to recruit better. Start with pitching and defense. Even with a relatively small stadium, power pitching will win out in Athens. Yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to that 2020 team that I think had a chance to really make some noise had the season taken place, 2 great frontline starting pitchers was kind of the bedrock foundation of that team. And, that's what you hope the new guy can provide because his background is in pitching, that you can kind of increase your overall pitching strength. And we could see some of that in the transfer portal here this year, right? Because, I think LSU's best pitcher this past year was a transfer from Air Force, I think. So you could see transfer pitchers paying big dividends for Georgia right away. And better pitching gives you a chance to win, obviously, in anything. Matt Rukavina reminding us that Georgia won the national championship with the equestrian team, so there you go. Keith Fold says, surely the SEC will move to a 9-game schedule when Oklahoma and Tennessee come in. I believe that they will. I think they are trying to sort of slow play this as a negotiation right now, but one way or another, I do believe eventually they'll move to a 9-game conference slate. I do. William Camacho says Oklahoma softball, the most complete team in the sport. No disrespect to the Lady Dogs. They played a great season. Yeah, it seems like Georgia did have a very good season, but Oklahoma does seem like it's kind of a different level here. Let's see what else. Daniel Aldridge says Florida State just eliminated the Tennessee team. I like that. That's in softball. I like that. Jeff Ingram does not think Auburn will beat Alabama. Well, that's what kind of makes the bold prediction, I guess. Let's see what else. A lot of folks still weighing on the Georgia-Florida thing over here. Phil Rogers talking about living there in Jacksonville, about watching the Marlins network when Atlanta's in Miami. Listen, I will tell you this, and we've talked about this before, Phil. it's actually not that easy to watch the Braves always in the local market right now either. Major League Baseball, I don't think it's done itself any favors. I feel like sometimes it'd be easier to follow the Braves if you did live somewhere else, because with half these games on, like, not half the games, but a good number of the games on, like, Apple TV on Fridays. You've got the weird, like, 11 a.m. thing on Sunday sometimes. What is that, on NBC or Peacock or something like that? I feel like Major League Baseball has done some weird stuff with its scheduling as of late. David Faulkner says the one thing you can count on if Georgia gets beat for a recruit, like maybe Sammy Brown yesterday, Kirby Smart's going to release one of the secret commitments shortly after that. So, David, maybe that is the way that worked out this morning. Who knows? Anything else on Facebook here? Yeah, a lot of talk about the Braves TV thing in here. All right, we're going to get ready to wrap up for today. It's getting late. Let me go back over to YouTube one more time, and we'll get ready to wrap up over there. UGA for Life Brunetti says, why is the mainstream hating on us so much after winning 2 national titles? So I don't think it's the hating thing quite as much. I don't think there's an anti-UGA bias. I do think there is this attempt to sort of cling to the past a little bit. And I kind of joke with Connor about, if the thing that was still, the best 10 years ago is still the best now, that means I must still be young. I think there's some of that kind of goes on a little bit with this. But I also just think that, hey, people are just sort of slow to evolve. People are kind of slow to recognize. And I do think it's fair if you're a Georgia fan to say that we're not being properly acknowledged. That's what you want to say about Georgia right now. I think it'd be probably a fair assessment to be able to make there. I really do. But I also think it gives you the opportunity to do this year what a lot of Georgia fans did a year ago, which is enjoy the chance to have a little bit of an edge, to enjoy laying waste to some critics and kind of vanquishing some critics. I think Georgia fans kind of enjoyed that. I think this Georgia team kind of enjoyed that. And I think they have fair ground to be able to do that again. Tennille, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Paul Moon, the subject of his Deeks. Wake Forest is really good, right? They're the number 1 overall. Isn't Wake Forest the number 1 overall seed? Yeah, they're really good. They talk about pitching staff. Wake Forest got some pitching right now. DMart42 says, I guess I don't really care that the mainstream media hates on UGA. They know less than 90% of our local people anyways. It's like arguing with G. Grace, which is very funny. Yeah, I mostly just sort of laugh at it. But when Kirk Herbstreit trots out the same opinion 2 years in a row, we are going to call him out for that. This idea of, when you can Alabama, that's when they're the most dangerous. Well, guess what? As we said yesterday, if you bet the house on that a year ago, you'd be sleeping in the street right now because you would have lost your house. You'd have spent your mortgage in Las Vegas if that was the case. So we mostly just sort of laugh at it. But when some of these guys trot out the same old tired opinion multiple years in a row, we are going to call them out for that. Let's see what else. Edward Hill says, bring back outside opinions from other parts of the country. Yeah, we'll probably do some of that here this summer for sure. Jonathan Aaron asks a good question. This is probably one of those things we need more time to break down. He says, if we don't have Kirby Smart anymore, do you think it's retirement, NFL, or another school? So I don't think there's any other college job that Kirby Smart would ever consider leaving Georgia for. I don't. I've always sort of felt like the chances of Kirby going to the NFL, I believe, are probably a little higher than some people think they are. I think that there are some people who assume that Kirby would never want to coach in the NFL. And I don't know that I necessarily believe that. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, of course. But I could see an outside chance of Kirby maybe one day considering the NFL, because I do think that Kirby enjoys the X's and O's part of the sport. I think he enjoys that. And I do believe that there is a lot of that in the NFL. And so, challenging himself in that way, it's certainly not my prediction that he would do that. But I am not. I'm a never say never when it comes to something like that. I also think there's a chance that the most likely of those scenarios might truly be, hey, maybe Kirby just doesn't want to do this for 100 years. Nick Saban coaching into his 70s, Joe Paterno coached into his 80s. Maybe Kirby doesn't want to do that. I think there's a chance that might be true. And if you rank the most likely, slightly early-ish retirement, you might rank number 1. I believe I'd rank the NFL number 2, and I'd rank coaching some other college team not even number 3. I'd rank that, that's the kind of thing I would probably be comfortable saying never to. I don't believe that Kirby would ever coach a different college team. But I'm not going to say never to coaching in the NFL, but I don't think that's what happened anytime soon. Jay Shipe says, what's the Big 12 going to do with the Longhorn Network? That's a good question. I guess they're just going to dissolve it, I guess. Andrew Hughes says, I plan on being at the first home game. I'll come grab my shirt then to save the shipping costs. Andrew, I promise we're going to take care of you. I know we've kind of fallen down on that. Most of that's really my fault. But we're going to take care of you for sure. Let us get ready to go. All right, good stuff. Yeah, by the way, Dawgs on top sharing what I was saying a moment ago. He says, it's easier to watch the Braves here in Dallas than when I travel to Georgia. It really is, because if you live in a non-local market, then your team is never blacked out. Isn't that right? That you can watch your game all the time. But if you live in the local market, there's certain times in which it's going to be blacked out or something like that. It's certainly a lot less confusing, I think. All right, we got to go. Good stuff. Thanks for being here. Y'all check out the AJC online, ajc.com. Braves getting ready to start a big series here at home against the New York Mets. Obviously, if you're a Georgia fan, you love hating on the orange and blue, lousy, stinking Gators. Then, kind of moving that in the direction of hating the New York Mets, a very easy thing to do. Most Georgia fans already do that pretty well anyway. So you've got them in town here. Nice preview of Braves Mets up at ajc.com. You also got, by the way, I guess no huge surprise here, Max Fried was placed in the 60-day DL. Michael Soroka going back to Gwinnett. So you can kind of follow some of that there. Hawks have made history with an assistant coaching hire. You can read more about that online at ajc.com. And 10 Metro Atlanta food and drink events coming up here this summer. You can check more about that out online, ajc.com as well. So follow all of that there. Also, R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that today. And if you want to stay cool and comfortable all summer long, go ahead and get that old tired AC unit that maybe somebody has told you needs to be replaced. Our friends at R.S. Andrews may be able to tell you how you can get new life, one more good year at that old tired unit. They can help you out with that. So find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We will look forward to talking to you then.